The screen in front of me froze on a single frame, and my stomach dropped before I even understood why. I was standing in the communications bay of the orbital station, my hands still shaking from the excitement of the signing ceremony only 6 hours earlier, when the alert light above the main terminal turned red. I remember thinking it had to be a system error. It was not. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and I was 26 years old on the night humanity's first treaty with the stars turned to ash before the sun rose over our own planet. I had been assigned as a junior liaison officer to the human delegation, a position I had earned through 3 years of language training and endless nights studying the customs of species I had never expected to meet in person. That morning, I had watched Ambassador Henry Calloway place his signature beside the mark of the Kesh Dominion's representative, a tall, silver-skinned being named Ambassador Threl Vantak, whose voice carried a strange musical quality that made every promise sound like a song. I had believed every word of it. The Concord Compact, they called it. A trade and protection agreement between Earth and the Dominion, along with 12 smaller allied worlds who had gathered to witness the moment humanity officially joined the wider galactic community. There had been applause. There had been toasts with drinks I could not pronounce the names of. There had been a strange, warm feeling in my chest that I now recognize as foolish hope. By the time I reached the communications bay that night, the feeling was gone. On the screen was a broadcast, already circulating across a dozen allied networks, carrying the official seal of the Dominion Assembly. It showed our delegation, but not as I remembered them. The footage had been altered so that Ambassador Calloway appeared to bow repeatedly, his posture twisted into something submissive and pleading. Audio that never left his mouth had been layered over the recording. Words of desperation and inferiority dressed up in his voice. Our ships, which had entered the system with full diplomatic clearance, were shown surrounded by Dominion escort vessels, as though we had been captured rather than welcomed. The caption beneath the footage read, in 6 different alien scripts, that Earth had begged for protection and had been granted mercy. I stood frozen, watching my own government's dignity, dismantled in real time, broadcast to every listening post between our solar system and the edge of Dominion territory. My hands would not stop trembling. Around me, 3 other officers stared at their own screens in identical silence, their faces lit by the pale blue glow of a lie spreading faster than truth ever could. I tried to reach the ambassador's office, but every channel was already flooded. I tried the station commander, and got only a busy signal. In the space of a few hours, every private agreement, every whispered promise of partnership made during the reception, had been rendered meaningless. The Dominion had not simply broken the treaty. They had rewritten the story of what happened in that room, and they had done it before we even had time to process what we had witnessed with our own eyes. I walked to the observation window and looked down at Earth, a blue curve glowing faintly against the dark, utterly unaware that its first attempt at diplomacy among the stars had just been publicly humiliated. I remember thinking that somewhere down there, people were sleeping peacefully, still believing the treaty had gone well. Still believing we had taken our first real step into a larger community of worlds. A message came through on my personal channel. It was from Ambassador Calloway himself, and it contained only 4 words. Do not respond yet. I did not understand the order at the time. Every instinct in me wanted to fire back an angry statement, to demand the footage be taken down, to shout into the void that we had been wronged. But I had learned enough about the ambassador during my months working under him to know that his silence was never empty. It was calculated. I spent the rest of that night in the communications bay, watching the false broadcast spread from network to network, watching alien commentators speculate about how a species so clearly desperate for protection could ever be trusted with equal standing among civilized worlds. Some were amused, some were dismissive. A few, I noticed, seemed almost sympathetic, though their sympathy was laced with the same condescension you might show a child who had wandered somewhere they did not belong. Around what would have been sunrise back home, though there was no true sunrise in the black of orbit, I received a summons to the ambassador's private office. I made my way through corridors that felt different than they had the day before, as though the station itself had absorbed the shame of what had happened and was holding it in its walls. Ambassador Calloway was not shouting when I entered. He was not even visibly angry. He sat behind a narrow steel desk, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him, reviewing the same broadcast I had been watching for hours. When he looked up at me, his expression was calm, in a way that unsettled me more than rage would have. He asked me a single question. He wanted to know whether I still had the original, unaltered recordings from our own delegation's cameras, the private feeds we had used for internal records rather than public broadcast. I confirmed that I did, stored on a secured drive that had never been connected to any external network. He nodded slowly, as though this answer confirmed something he had already suspected. He told me that the Dominion had likely assumed Earth would react the way smaller, newer species always reacted to this kind of humiliation, with immediate outrage, hurried denials, and clumsy attempts to explain ourselves that would only make us look more desperate. He said that reaction was exactly what they wanted, because it would prove their false narrative correct in the eyes of every species watching. A species that has been humiliated and then scrambles to defend itself only confirms, in the minds of onlookers, that the humiliation struck a nerve of truth. Instead, he told me, we were going to do something the Dominion had clearly never expected from us. We were going to do nothing at all, not yet. I asked him how long we could afford to wait while our reputation continued to collapse across every allied network. His answer stayed with me for the rest of that long, strange year. He said that reputation built on lies collapses on its own, the moment the truth is presented with patience instead of panic. But reputation defended too quickly, too emotionally, collapses because it looks like guilt. I did not fully understand what he meant that night. I understood it much better months later, aboard a single human vessel entering territory where our name had become a punchline. Before I left his office, he gave me an assignment that would change the direction of my life. He told me to begin compiling every recorded interaction our delegation had ever had with the Dominion, every private communication, every internal note, every raw camera feed, cross-referenced with timestamps that could never be disputed. He wanted a complete, unaltered record of everything that had actually happened, built with such careful documentation that no future claim against us could ever be sustained without immediate and total collapse under scrutiny. I spent the next several weeks barely sleeping, working alongside a small team of analysts who had been quietly reassigned from other departments. We were told almost nothing about the larger plan. We were simply told to build something that could not be argued with, something so thoroughly documented that even those inclined to doubt us would find themselves unable to construct a counter-argument. During this time, the humiliation continued to spread. I watched news feeds from Allied systems mock Earth's supposed weakness. I watched trade partners quietly withdraw preliminary offers that had been extended before the signing. I watched smaller species, who might once have been curious about forming their own relationships with humanity, begin to treat us the way one treats a family known for embarrassing itself in public, with polite distance and private amusement. What surprised me most was not the mockery from strangers. It was the silence from Earth's own government in response to it. No press conferences, no angry statements, no demands for the footage to be corrected. To anyone watching from outside, it must have looked exactly like confirmation, as though we had accepted our humiliation and simply gone quiet out of shame. I remember speaking with a colleague, a communications specialist named Emma Sutcliffe, during one of the rare breaks we allowed ourselves that month. She asked me whether I thought the ambassador's strategy was working, or whether we were simply watching our reputation die a slow, silent death, while pretending it was part of some larger plan. I did not have an answer for her then. I only had faith, the same fragile kind of faith I had carried into the signing ceremony weeks earlier, though this time it was tempered by something closer to determination than hope. What none of us understood yet, not even the analysts working closest to the ambassador, was that the silence was never really silence at all. It was the sound of a case being built, piece by piece, with a patience that no species watching us had thought humanity capable of. 3 weeks after the false broadcast first appeared, I was called into a secured briefing room I had never been permitted to enter before. Inside were faces I did not recognize, along with several I did, including Ambassador Calloway, and a woman introduced to me only as Director Claire Ashworth, who I would later learn oversaw a branch of Earth's government responsible for matters far beyond simple diplomacy. Director Ashworth informed the room that the documentation effort I had been leading was now complete enough to move to the next phase. She said that a vessel was being prepared, one that would carry not weapons meant for open conflict, but something the Dominion had clearly never anticipated from a species they believed had been thoroughly and permanently humbled. She did not elaborate further that day. She simply asked whether I would be willing to serve aboard that vessel as part of its intelligence and documentation team, given my direct involvement in gathering the very evidence that would soon be put to use. I agreed without hesitation, though I still did not fully understand what I was agreeing to. That night, alone in my quarters aboard the station, I opened the false broadcast one more time and watched it in full for what I told myself would be the last time before we responded. I watched Ambassador Calloway's altered image bow again and again, his stolen voice pleading for mercy that had never actually been requested. I felt something shift inside me as I watched it, a transformation of the humiliation I had felt weeks earlier into something colder and far more useful. I realized, watching that broadcast for the final time, that the Dominion had made a mistake they did not yet know they had made. They had assumed that humiliating us publicly would end the matter before it truly began. They did not understand that every lie they told, every falsified frame of footage, every twisted word placed in our ambassador's mouth, was being carefully preserved, catalogued, and prepared for a moment they had never imagined possible. They had burned every agreement by dawn, confident that a young, inexperienced species would have no answer for such a public and total humiliation. They had no idea that we were simply waiting for the right moment to answer. I closed the recording, turned off the lights in my quarters, and for the first time since that terrible night in the communications bay, I slept without dreaming of the broadcast at all. I dreamed instead of the vessel being prepared somewhere beyond my clearance level, and of the strange, quiet confidence I had heard in Ambassador Calloway's voice when he told me that patience, not anger, was the only weapon that could not be turned back against us. I did not yet know the name of the ship I would soon board, or the scale of what Earth intended to reveal once it arrived among the very worlds that had laughed at our expense. I only knew that somewhere in the silence we had maintained for 3 long weeks, something was being built that the galaxy was not prepared for. The morning after that briefing, I returned to the documentation center to continue my work, and for the first time since the humiliation began, I did not feel ashamed when I thought about what had happened. I felt something closer to anticipation, the quiet, steady kind that comes before a storm you know you are prepared for, even if no one watching you yet realizes a storm is coming at all. The silence lasted longer than anyone outside our small circle expected, and I began to understand that silence, when used correctly, could be sharper than any accusation. 6 weeks after the false broadcast first spread across the Allied networks, I was transferred from the orbital station to a secured facility, hidden beneath the mountains of a location I was not permitted to name even in private conversation. The transfer happened without ceremony. A transport shuttle arrived before dawn, and I was told to bring only what I could carry in a single bag. Emma Sutcliffe was transferred alongside me, along with 4 other analysts from the documentation team, though none of us were told where exactly we were going until the shuttle doors closed behind us. The facility, when we arrived, felt less like a government building and more like a vault. Long corridors lined with unmarked doors led to rooms filled with servers and analysts, working in near silence, each one focused on a task that seemed disconnected from the others until you stepped back and realized every piece was part of the same enormous puzzle. I was assigned to a room deep within the complex, where I was reunited with the same secured drive I had protected since the night of the false broadcast, though it had grown considerably since then. Director Ashworth explained our purpose during our first full briefing inside the facility. She told us that Earth's government had spent the 6 weeks since the humiliation gathering something far more valuable than an angry response. They had been gathering patterns. Every falsified broadcast follows a method, she explained, a signature style of manipulation that repeats itself across different targets, if you know where to look. The Dominion had used this exact tactic before, against other species, long before Earth had ever entered the galactic community. I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief and anger when she said this. Relief, because it meant we were not alone in what had happened to us. Anger, because it meant an entire pattern of cruelty had gone unchallenged for who knew how many years, simply because no other species had possessed the patience or the resources to document it properly. Our task in the following months was to cross-reference every fragment of intelligence Earth had quietly gathered, some of it purchased through discreet trade contacts, some of it offered voluntarily by smaller species who had suffered similar humiliations and had never had the means to prove it. I spent long hours studying broadcast footage from 3 other species entirely, watching the same techniques used against us appear again and again in different forms. A leader from a species called the Marrow had been shown groveling in a broadcast eerily similar to ours. A trade delegation from a smaller world called Tessin Prime had been shown surrendering resources they had never actually agreed to surrender. Each new discovery deepened my understanding of what we were truly building. This was never only about clearing Earth's name. It was about exposing a method of control that had kept dozens of species compliant and quiet for generations, each one believing they were the only ones foolish enough to have been deceived, each one too ashamed or too afraid to speak publicly about what had happened to them. During one long night shift, Emma and I sat together, reviewing testimony gathered from a Tessin Prime trade representative named Odrin Kalis, who had agreed to speak with Earth's investigators under strict confidentiality. His account matched our own experience with unsettling precision. He described a signing ceremony filled with apparent warmth, followed within hours by a broadcast twisting every word his delegation had spoken. He described watching his own government's reputation dissolve overnight, and the crushing isolation that followed, as other species began treating his people with the same quiet mockery I had witnessed directed at us. Emma turned to me after we finished reviewing his testimony and asked whether I thought Earth would actually use everything we were gathering, or whether it would simply sit in an archive somewhere, a quiet record of injustice that never translated into consequence. I told her I did not know, but that I trusted the patience the ambassador had shown so far, even if I did not yet understand its final purpose. It was during this period that I first heard mention of the vessel Director Ashworth had referenced during our earlier briefing. She called it at first only a delivery platform, a term so deliberately bland that none of us thought much of it. It was not until I was called into a private meeting with both Ashworth and Ambassador Calloway that I began to understand what the term actually meant. The ambassador explained that Earth's engineers had spent the past several months designing a single vessel unlike anything humanity had built before. Its purpose was not combat, though it carried defenses more than capable of protecting itself if provoked. Its true purpose was to serve as an unquestionable source of truth, carrying within its systems a complete, verified, tamper-proof record of every falsified broadcast the Dominion had used against Earth and against the other species we had quietly gathered testimony from. He told me the vessel had been designed to broadcast this record directly into the heart of the Interstellar Accord Assembly, the governing body responsible for mediating disputes between species across allied space, using a method that could not be intercepted, altered, or dismissed as fabricated propaganda, the way the Dominion had so easily dismissed similar claims in the past. I asked him why Earth had chosen this method instead of simply presenting the evidence through traditional diplomatic channels. His answer was simple and, in hindsight, obvious. Traditional channels could be delayed, buried in procedure, or quietly suppressed by species allied with the Dominion, long before the truth ever reached a wide audience. A single vessel, arriving without warning and broadcasting undeniable evidence directly to every listening post in range, could not be silenced in the same way. I was told that I would serve aboard this vessel once it was completed, continuing the documentation work I had already begun, ensuring that every piece of evidence remained properly organized and ready for presentation the moment the ship reached its destination. I accepted the assignment immediately, though a part of me still felt the same nervous uncertainty I had carried since the night of the false broadcast. The months that followed were filled with preparation unlike anything I had experienced before. I traveled briefly to the shipyard where the vessel was being constructed, a facility hidden within an asteroid field far from any established trade route. Seeing the ship for the first time left me speechless. It was smaller than I expected, sleek and unassuming compared to the massive warships I had seen in Dominion propaganda broadcasts over the years. Its captain, a calm and precise woman named Grace Sullivan, met with our documentation team personally to review how the evidence systems would integrate with the ship's broadcast array. Captain Sullivan struck me immediately as someone who understood the weight of what we were preparing to do. During our first conversation, she told me that she had spent years studying diplomatic history across multiple species, searching for examples of smaller powers overturning false narratives spread by larger ones. She said she had found very few successful examples, and every one of them shared a common trait. The truth had to be presented with such overwhelming, undeniable clarity that no amount of denial could survive contact with it. She told me our mission would not succeed through anger or through demands for apology. It would succeed only if we presented the evidence so completely, so methodically, and so calmly that every species watching would be forced to confront the reality of what had happened, not because we told them to be outraged, but because the truth itself would leave no other reasonable conclusion available to them. I spent the following weeks working alongside Captain Sullivan's crew, integrating our documentation into the ship's systems, running countless simulations of how the broadcast would appear once activated, testing and retesting every safeguard that would prevent the Dominion from claiming our evidence had been altered or fabricated the same way they had altered footage of us. During one of these late testing sessions, Emma asked me a question that stayed with me for the rest of our preparation. She wanted to know what would happen if the Assembly simply refused to watch the broadcast, if the Dominion's influence over allied species proved strong enough to prevent our evidence from ever reaching a meaningful audience. I did not have a confident answer for her, though Captain Sullivan, who overheard the question, offered one instead. She said that truth delivered with patience does not need permission to be heard. It only needs a moment of undivided attention, and the confidence of everyone who arrives prepared with facts is worth more in the long run than the confidence of anyone who arrives prepared only with lies. She said the Dominion had built their power on being believed instead of being honest, and a foundation built that way could survive almost any challenge except one, an opponent patient enough to gather truth so complete it could not be denied. I found myself thinking of Ambassador Threl Vantak, the same alien representative who had signed the treaty beside Ambassador Calloway with a voice like music, only to help orchestrate its destruction hours later. I wondered whether he understood, even now, the scale of what Earth had been quietly assembling in response to his species' arrogance. I suspected he did not, and something in that thought gave me a strange, steady confidence of my own. As our preparation neared its final stages, Director Ashworth visited the shipyard personally to review our progress. She gathered the entire crew, along with the documentation team, for a final briefing before departure. She reminded us that our mission was not one of conflict, but one of clarity. She reminded us that the entire galaxy had watched Earth humiliated within hours of our first treaty, and that this same galaxy would soon watch us respond, not with the panic the Dominion expected, but with a patience and precision they had never imagined a young species like ours capable of. She told us that the ship, once launched, would carry a name chosen deliberately for its symbolism, a name meant to reflect not aggression, but the steady, unshakable presentation of truth that Earth intended to deliver. The vessel would be called the Steadfast Accord, a quiet rebuke to the very treaty the Dominion had so publicly and so falsely claimed we had begged for. I remember standing on the shipyard platform the night before our departure, looking out at the Steadfast Accord as it rested silently against the backdrop of distant stars, its hull catching faint light from a sun I could not name. I thought of the humiliation I had witnessed months earlier, the false broadcast that had shattered our first treaty before dawn, and the long, careful silence that had followed while Earth quietly built something the galaxy had never seen coming. For the first time since that terrible night in the communications bay, I felt something closer to certainty than fear. We were no longer simply reacting to what had happened to us. We were preparing to answer it, completely, calmly, and on our own terms, in front of every species who had once believed our silence meant surrender. The following morning, as the Steadfast Accord's engines powered on for the first time, I took my place among the documentation crew and watched Earth grow smaller behind us through the observation window. I did not know exactly what awaited us at the edge of Dominion territory, but I understood, finally, the true purpose of the patience we had carried for so many months. We were not traveling toward conflict. We were traveling toward the truth, and we were bringing enough of it to change how an entire galaxy understood the species that had once been so easily dismissed as beneath their notice. The moment we crossed into territory monitored by Dominion listening posts, every alarm on the Steadfast Accord activated at once, and I understood immediately that our arrival had not gone unnoticed. Captain Sullivan remained calm at the center of the bridge, her voice steady, as she ordered the crew to hold formation and continue toward our planned course without deviation. I stood near the documentation terminal, watching sensor readings display 3 unfamiliar vessels approaching from a nearby patrol station, their configuration matching Dominion escort ships I had studied extensively during our preparation. My pulse quickened, though I forced myself to remember Captain Sullivan's words from months earlier. We were not traveling toward conflict. We were traveling toward truth, and truth needed only the chance to be heard. A transmission request appeared on our communications display moments later, originating from the lead escort vessel. Captain Sullivan accepted it without hesitation. The face that appeared on our screen belonged to a Dominion officer I did not recognize, his expression carrying the same faint condescension I remembered from the signing ceremony months earlier. He addressed us directly, asking why a single human vessel had entered neutral territory without prior clearance, his tone suggesting he already expected an answer filled with apology or explanation. Captain Sullivan's response surprised even those of us who had worked alongside her for months. She informed him, calmly and without hesitation, that the Steadfast Accord was traveling under full diplomatic protocol toward the Interstellar Accord Assembly, carrying evidence relevant to a formal grievance Earth intended to present before the full council. She requested no special treatment and offered no explanation beyond what was required, closing the transmission before the officer could respond with anything beyond visible confusion. I watched the escort vessels hold their position rather than intercept us, likely uncertain how to respond to a request so formally correct that denying it would have violated protocols the Dominion themselves had established generations earlier. It was the first moment I truly understood the strategy behind Captain Sullivan's calm confidence. The Dominion had built their influence on manipulation and intimidation, but they had also built layers of official procedure meant to appear fair to the many species watching them. By following that procedure with absolute precision, we denied them the excuse to stop us without exposing their own hypocrisy in the process. The following days aboard the Steadfast Accord passed with a strange combination of tension and routine. Our documentation team continued refining the presentation systems, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly indexed and ready for immediate broadcast the moment we reached the assembly. Emma worked alongside me during most of these sessions, her focus sharper than I had seen it during our earlier months of preparation back on Earth. I asked her once whether she felt afraid, given how close we now were to territory controlled almost entirely by the very species who had humiliated us months earlier. She admitted that she did, but said the fear felt different now, less like the helpless panic she remembered from the night of the false broadcast, and more like the focused nervousness of someone about to do something they had spent a very long time preparing for. During one of these sessions, I found myself speaking privately with Captain Sullivan about the scale of what awaited us. She told me she had reviewed extensive historical records of the Assembly's proceedings, studying how disputes between species had been resolved, or more often left unresolved, over the decades since its formation. She explained that the Assembly rarely intervened directly in matters between individual species, preferring instead to allow disputes to resolve themselves through private negotiation, a preference that conveniently benefited larger, more established powers like the Dominion, who held significant influence over smaller species through trade agreements and quiet economic pressure. She told me that our evidence needed to accomplish something the Assembly had rarely been forced to confront directly, a demonstration so undeniable and so public that ignoring it would damage the credibility of the Assembly itself rather than simply the credibility of the species being accused. This was why every detail of our presentation had been designed with such careful precision, why every piece of testimony had been gathered with such exhaustive documentation, and why the broadcast systems aboard our ship had been built to resist any claim of tampering or fabrication. 3 days before our scheduled arrival at the Assembly's central station, we received an unexpected transmission from a source outside official Dominion channels. The message arrived through an encrypted frequency our documentation team had quietly established months earlier, while gathering testimony from smaller species who feared retaliation for speaking against the Dominion openly. The transmission came from Odrin Callis, the Tessin Prime representative, whose testimony had proven so valuable during our earlier investigation. His message was brief but urgent. He informed us that word of our approach had already reached several smaller species allied loosely with the Dominion, and that quiet conversations were beginning to spread among delegates who had never previously questioned the official narrative surrounding their own disputes with the Dominion. He warned us that Dominion representatives were already working to discredit our mission before we arrived, spreading rumors that Earth intended to disrupt the assembly, with false accusations meant to distract from our own failures during the original treaty signing. I brought this information immediately to Captain Sullivan and Director Ashworth, who had remained aboard the ship throughout our journey to oversee the diplomatic aspects of our mission personally. Rather than expressing concern, Director Ashworth seemed almost pleased by the news. She explained that any attempt to discredit us before we had even presented our evidence would only appear more suspicious once that evidence was finally revealed, particularly to delegates who were already beginning to question the official narrative on their own. She reminded the crew during a brief gathering shortly afterward that our strategy had never depended on the Dominion behaving fairly or honestly. It depended entirely on the strength and clarity of the truth we carried, delivered at a moment, and in a manner the Dominion could not control or distort the way they had controlled the narrative surrounding our original treaty signing. As we drew closer to the Assembly's central station, I spent long hours reviewing the full presentation one final time, checking every timestamp, every cross-reference, every piece of testimony against the master archive stored deep within the ship's most secure systems. I thought often of Ambassador Calloway during these final preparations, remembering his calm instruction from months earlier to do nothing in response to our humiliation, not because nothing needed to be done, but because the right response required patience the Dominion had clearly never expected from us. I also found myself thinking of the smaller species whose testimony we now carried, imagining what it must have felt like for representatives like Odrin Kalis to finally have a chance, through our efforts, to see their own experiences validated and exposed, after years of quiet suffering under a system designed to keep them isolated and ashamed. Their trust in us, offered at considerable personal risk, carried a weight I felt determined not to fail. 2 days before our arrival, the Steadfast Accord received official confirmation that our request to address the Assembly had been accepted, though the confirmation carried an unmistakable note of skepticism from the Assembly's administrative office. We were granted a formal speaking slot during the next full council session, though the message made clear that our time would be strictly limited and subject to procedural rules that could easily be used to interrupt or dismiss our presentation, if any technical violation occurred. Captain Sullivan reviewed these procedural rules personally, working alongside Director Ashworth to ensure every aspect of our presentation complied precisely with Assembly protocol, denying the Dominion any legitimate excuse to halt our broadcast once it began. I remember admiring the sheer thoroughness of their preparation, understanding finally why Earth had chosen to wait so many months before responding to our humiliation, rather than reacting immediately in anger. On the final night before our arrival, I stood alone in the observation deck, looking out at the distant lights of the assembly station growing larger against the darkness ahead of us. Emma joined me quietly, and for a long while neither of us spoke, both lost in our own thoughts about what awaited us the following day. She eventually broke the silence, asking whether I believed the assembly would truly listen once we finally presented our evidence, or whether the Dominion's influence would prove too deeply rooted for even undeniable truth to overcome. I told her I did not know for certain, but that I had come to trust the patience Earth had shown throughout this entire ordeal, a patience built not on hope alone, but on the careful, methodical construction of a case so complete that dismissing it would require the assembly to abandon its own claimed principles entirely. She nodded slowly, then asked one final question that lingered with me long after our conversation ended. She wanted to know what I hoped would happen once the truth was finally revealed, not for Earth as a whole, but for those of us who had spent months buried in the painful details of every falsified broadcast and every silenced testimony we had gathered along the way. I told her that I hoped, more than anything, that the smaller species who had trusted us with their own quiet histories of humiliation would finally see their experiences acknowledged publicly, not as isolated incidents of misfortune, but as part of a pattern too large and too consistent to be dismissed any longer. I told her that whatever happened to Earth's own reputation in the process, exposing that pattern felt like something worth the risk we were about to take. As the assembly station grew closer through the observation window, its lights sharpening into individual structures I could finally make out with my own eyes, I felt the same steady certainty I had carried since the night the Steadfast Accord first launched from Earth's shipyard. We were not arriving as a humiliated species seeking apology or sympathy. We were arriving as a species that had spent months gathering truth with a patience the Dominion had never imagined possible, prepared finally to present it in front of every delegate who had once laughed at our expense. The following morning, as the Steadfast Accord entered final approach toward the Assembly's central docking array, Captain Sullivan gathered the entire crew one final time before our arrival. She reminded us that everything we had prepared for over the past several months would soon be tested in front of an audience that included every species who had witnessed our original humiliation, along with many who had never known the full extent of what the Dominion had done to species far smaller and far less capable of defending themselves than we were. She told us that regardless of how the Assembly ultimately responded, we had already accomplished something the Dominion had clearly never expected from a species they believed thoroughly humbled by a single night of manipulation months earlier. We had refused to disappear quietly, and we had refused to respond with the anger and desperation they had counted on to confirm their false narrative in the eyes of every species watching. As the docking clamps engaged and the Steadfast Accord came to rest within the assembly station, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the same steady confidence Captain Sullivan had carried since our very first conversation months earlier aboard the shipyard platform. Whatever awaited us within the assembly chamber, we had arrived prepared, patient, and ready finally to answer a humiliation that had begun with a single false broadcast and a burned agreement, delivered publicly by dawn, so many months before. The assembly chamber was larger than anything I had imagined during our months of preparation, a vast circular hall filled with delegates from dozens of species, each seated within their own designated section beneath a domed ceiling that displayed a slow, shifting map of Allied space above us. I entered alongside Captain Sullivan, Director Ashworth, and a small escort of crew members permitted to accompany our formal delegation. Ambassador Calloway had traveled separately to the station weeks earlier to establish proper diplomatic footing before our arrival, and I saw him waiting near the central podium as we entered, his expression unreadable, in the same calm manner I remembered from the night of our original humiliation. I felt hundreds of unfamiliar eyes turned toward us as we walked toward our designated section, a quiet murmur rippling through sections of the chamber, occupied by species who clearly recognized our arrival from the broadcast that had spread so widely months earlier. I forced myself to keep my expression steady, remembering Captain Sullivan's repeated reminders that our presentation needed to embody the same calm patience that had guided every decision since the night our first treaty was burned. Near the far side of the chamber, I spotted the unmistakable silver form of Ambassador Threl Vantak, seated among the Dominion delegation with an expression of polite curiosity that did little to hide the tension I sensed beneath it. Beside him sat several other Dominion officials I did not recognize, along with delegates from species I knew had long been allied closely with Dominion interests. The session opened with standard procedural matters, votes on minor trade disputes between species I had never heard of, resolutions concerning shared resource agreements along contested borders. I found myself struggling to focus on these early proceedings, my attention constantly drifting toward the moment our own presentation would finally begin. When the presiding officer, an elderly delegate from a species called the Orion, finally called for our formal request to address the assembly, I felt the entire chamber's attention shift toward our section. Captain Sullivan rose first, walking toward the central podium with the same steady confidence she had carried throughout our entire journey. She began by acknowledging the Assembly's rules regarding formal grievances, confirming that our presentation would comply fully with every procedural requirement before requesting permission to proceed. The presiding officer granted this request, though I noticed several Dominion delegates exchanging quiet glances as she spoke, clearly uncertain how to respond to a presentation being conducted with such careful, deliberate formality, rather than the emotional outburst they had likely expected. Captain Sullivan explained, calmly and without exaggeration, that months earlier, following the signing of a treaty between Earth and the Dominion, a broadcast had spread across Allied networks, depicting Earth's delegation in a manner that did not match the actual events of that signing. She stated plainly that Earth possessed complete, Verified documentation proving this discrepancy, along with additional evidence suggesting this was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern affecting multiple species across Allied space. A murmur spread through the chamber at this final statement, and I saw several Dominion delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ambassador Vantak rose immediately, requesting formal objection to what he described as an unsubstantiated accusation designed to distract from Earth's own diplomatic shortcomings. The presiding officer granted his objection a brief hearing, and I watched Captain Sullivan respond with the same calm precision she had shown throughout our entire preparation. She informed the chamber that Earth was not asking anyone to accept our claims based on assertion alone. She was requesting permission to present verified evidence, gathered and documented according to standards the Assembly itself had established for exactly this type of grievance, and she asked that any objection be reserved until after that evidence had been fully reviewed. The presiding officer, after a brief consultation with the Assembly's procedural advisors, granted our request to proceed, overruling Ambassador Vantak's objection for the moment, while noting that he would be permitted to respond fully once our presentation concluded. What followed was, in my opinion, the moment Earth's entire strategy finally revealed its true purpose. Captain Sullivan activated the Steadfast Accord's broadcast systems, projecting the original, unaltered footage from our delegation's private recordings directly onto the massive display above the central podium, positioned beside the false broadcast that had spread across Allied networks months earlier. The two recordings played simultaneously, frame by frame, timestamp by timestamp, revealing with undeniable clarity exactly how the footage had been altered. Ambassador Calloway's calm, formal handshake in the original recording appeared beside the twisted, submissive bow inserted into the false broadcast. His genuine words of partnership appeared as text alongside the fabricated pleading dialogue that had been layered over his voice in the manipulated version. I watched the chamber fall into a silence, unlike anything I had witnessed since our arrival. Delegates who had laughed along with the false broadcast months earlier now stared at the undeniable comparison playing before them, their expressions shifting from curiosity to visible discomfort as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. Captain Sullivan did not stop there. She proceeded to present the additional testimony our documentation team had gathered over the preceding months, beginning with the account from Odrin Kalis of Tessin Prime, whose own experience with a nearly identical manipulation played alongside verified evidence confirming his account. She continued with testimony from the Marrow delegation, whose own falsified broadcast bore the same unmistakable editing patterns as the footage used against both Earth and Tessin Prime. I watched delegates throughout the chamber begin whispering urgently among themselves as the pattern became undeniable, species after species recognizing similarities to disputes within their own history that had never been properly investigated or resolved. A representative from a small trade collective near the edge of Allied space rose unexpectedly during a brief pause in our presentation, requesting permission to speak. The presiding officer granted this request, and the representative, a quiet, hesitant delegate I did not recognize, described an incident from years earlier involving a broadcast remarkably similar to the ones we had just presented, an incident her own government had quietly accepted at the time, due to overwhelming pressure from Allied trade partners who had refused to support any formal investigation. This unexpected testimony sent a new wave of murmurs through the chamber, and I saw Ambassador Vantak's calm expression finally begin to crack, his posture stiffening as delegate after delegate began requesting permission to speak, each one recalling similar suspicions from their own history that had never before been given a platform serious enough to investigate properly. Captain Sullivan allowed these interruptions to continue for several minutes before requesting permission to resume our formal presentation, explaining that Earth had prepared additional evidence directly addressing the technical methods used to create these falsified broadcasts, methods that could be independently verified by any delegation with access to appropriate forensic analysis tools. She introduced, at this point, a detailed technical breakdown prepared by our documentation team, explaining the specific editing techniques used to alter the original footage, techniques that left detectable traces within the metadata of the broadcast files themselves, traces that had been carefully preserved and cross-referenced across every falsified recording we had gathered evidence for. I watched several delegates from technically advanced species leaned forward with genuine interest as this analysis played across the display, their earlier skepticism visibly shifting towards something closer to serious consideration. A delegate from a species known for its expertise in communications technology requested permission to have his own technical team independently verify our findings, a request Captain Sullivan agreed to immediately, offering full access to the raw, unaltered data our team had gathered. Ambassador Vantak rose again, his composure clearly strained, as he attempted to redirect the chamber's attention back toward his earlier objection, arguing that even if discrepancies existed within the broadcast footage, this did not prove intentional manipulation on the part of the Dominion, rather than simple technical error during transmission. Captain Sullivan responded to this claim calmly, presenting a final piece of evidence our team had uncovered only weeks before our departure, an internal Dominion communication intercepted through channels Director Ashworth had never fully explained to me, revealing explicit discussion among Dominion officials regarding the deliberate editing of the original footage before its release, along with direct instructions regarding how the manipulation should be conducted to maximize its intended effect on Earth's reputation among allied species. The chamber fell into complete silence as this final piece of evidence played across the display, the internal communication leaving no reasonable room for the explanation of simple technical error that Ambassador Vantak had attempted to offer moments earlier. I watched him remain standing for a long moment, clearly searching for some response that might salvage the situation, before finally sitting back down without offering any further objection. Around the chamber, I saw delegates from species who had once mocked Earth's supposed weakness, now regarding the Dominion delegation with expressions of open suspicion, the same quiet, condescending confidence I remembered from the Dominion's representatives during our original treaty signing, now visibly absent from their posture. The presiding officer called for a brief recess, following the conclusion of our formal presentation, informing the chamber that the assembly would reconvene to discuss appropriate next steps once delegates had time to review the evidence we had provided in full detail. As the chamber began to empty for the recess, I found myself standing beside Captain Sullivan near the central podium, watching delegates from multiple species approach our section, some offering quiet words of support, others requesting additional information regarding the technical verification process we had described during our presentation. Emma joined me a few moments later, her expression carrying the same mixture of relief and lingering tension I felt myself. She asked whether I believed we had done enough to convince the assembly of the truth we had spent so many months documenting. I told her I did not know for certain, but that regardless of what happened during the remainder of the session, we had accomplished something the Dominion had clearly never anticipated. We had refused to disappear quietly into the humiliation they had designed for us, and we had forced an entire chamber of species to confront a pattern of manipulation that had likely gone unchallenged for far longer than any of us had previously understood. As the recess continued, I noticed Ambassador Vantak speaking quietly with several other Dominion officials near their designated section, his earlier composure now replaced with visible urgency as he gestured toward data displays none of the rest of us could see clearly from our position. Whatever calm confidence the Dominion delegation had carried into this session had clearly begun to unravel, and I found myself wondering, as the chamber slowly refilled for the assembly's continued discussion, exactly how far that unraveling would ultimately reach. When the assembly reconvened, the atmosphere within the chamber had shifted so completely that I barely recognized it as the same room we had entered hours earlier. Delegates who had greeted our arrival with quiet murmurs of curiosity now watched our section with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable, though I understood it stemmed from something far different than the mockery I had feared before our presentation began. Whispered conversations continued throughout the chamber as the presiding officer called the session back to order, requesting that delegates hold further discussion until the assembly had formally addressed the evidence we had presented. The presiding officer invited additional testimony from any delegation wishing to share relevant experience related to the pattern of manipulation we had described. I watched, almost in disbelief, as delegate after delegate rose to speak, each account adding another piece to the pattern that had been quietly hidden for so long across so many different corners of Allied space. A representative from a species called the Halvex described an incident nearly a decade earlier, involving a trade agreement with the Dominion that had similarly collapsed overnight, following a broadcast none of their officials had ever fully understood the origin of. At the time, their government had simply absorbed the loss quietly, assuming the failure reflected poorly on their own negotiating skill, rather than any deliberate manipulation from the other side. A quieter delegate from a small agricultural collective near the outer trade routes described a similar experience, though her account carried an added layer of sorrow as she explained how her people had lost access to a critical trade partnership as a direct result of a falsified broadcast, a loss that had led to genuine hardship for her community in the years that followed, hardship they had never understood the true cause of until witnessing our presentation earlier that day. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest as I listened to these accounts, understanding more clearly with each new testimony the scale of harm this pattern of manipulation had caused, across species far less capable than Earth of eventually documenting and exposing it. I thought of Emma's earlier question about what I hoped would come from our efforts, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose as I watched species after species finally given a platform to share experiences they had carried alone for years. Ambassador Vantak requested permission to respond following this extended session of testimony, and the presiding officer granted it, though I noticed a distinct shift in the officer's tone, a formality that no longer carried the same automatic deference toward Dominion representatives that I had sensed during earlier procedural matters. Vantak's response, when it finally came, surprised me in its restraint. Rather than continuing to deny the pattern outright, he acknowledged that certain individual incidents may have occurred without full oversight from Dominion leadership, framing them as isolated actions by individual officials rather than an organized, systemic approach sanctioned by the Dominion as a whole. Captain Sullivan requested permission to respond to this claim, and the presiding officer granted it. She reminded the chamber of the internal communication we had presented earlier, evidence that explicitly outlined coordinated instructions for the manipulation of Earth's own broadcast footage, evidence that made clear this was not the action of a single rogue official acting without oversight, but a deliberate, organized strategy, discussed at a level of Dominion leadership far too senior to reasonably claim ignorance of. I watched several delegates nod in visible agreement as she spoke, and I noticed the presiding officer make a note within the Assembly's official record, a gesture that carried far more weight within this chamber than I had initially understood during our earlier procedural briefings. The discussion continued for several more hours, delegates debating the appropriate response to evidence that had grown far larger in scope than a single dispute between Earth and the Dominion. Some delegates called for immediate consequences against Dominion leadership, while others urged caution, reminding the chamber that formal consequences required additional verification beyond what a single session could reasonably provide, regardless of how compelling the evidence appeared. During a brief pause in this debate, I found myself approached quietly by Odrin Kalis, the Tessin Prime representative whose testimony had proven so valuable during our earlier investigation. He thanked me personally for the effort our documentation team had put into verifying his account, telling me that he had never expected, when he first agreed to share his testimony months earlier, that it would eventually be presented before the full assembly, alongside evidence from so many other species who had suffered similarly. He told me that regardless of the assembly's final decision, the simple act of having his experience acknowledged publicly, rather than dismissed as an isolated failure on his own government's part, had already changed something important for his people, a validation they had waited years to receive without ever believing it would actually come. I felt a quiet satisfaction listening to his words, understanding finally the full weight of what Ambassador Calloway had meant months earlier, when he told me that patience, not anger, was the only response capable of surviving contact with a lie, built to provoke immediate emotional reaction. As the session continued into its later hours, the presiding officer called for a formal vote regarding the establishment of an independent investigative committee, tasked with reviewing the full scope of evidence presented that day, along with any additional testimony that might come forward from other species following our presentation. The vote passed with an overwhelming majority, a result that visibly stunned several members of the Dominion delegation, who had clearly expected their traditional influence over allied species to prevent such a decisive outcome. I watched Ambassador Vantak's expression during the vote count, his earlier composure now entirely absent, replaced by something closer to genuine concern, as delegate after delegate cast their support in favor of formal investigation. Beside him, several other Dominion officials exchanged worried glances, clearly recalculating whatever strategy they had originally intended to rely on before our arrival had disrupted it so thoroughly. Following the vote, the presiding officer announced that the newly established committee would begin its work immediately, with full access to the evidence Earth had provided, along with authority to gather additional testimony from any species wishing to contribute to the ongoing investigation. He thanked our delegation formally for bringing this matter before the Assembly, with what he described as an unusually thorough and carefully documented presentation, a compliment that carried far more weight coming from a delegate who had presided over countless disputes throughout his long service to the Assembly. As the session finally adjourned for the day, I found myself standing once again beside Captain Sullivan, near the central podium, watching the chamber slowly empty around us. She turned to me with a rare, quiet smile, telling me that regardless of what the investigative committee ultimately concluded, we had already accomplished something Earth had never previously achieved among the wider galactic community. We had been heard, not dismissed, not mocked, but genuinely heard, by an assembly that had every reason to favor the established influence of the Dominion over the untested claims of a species so recently humiliated before their very eyes. Emma joined us shortly afterward, her expression carrying a visible relief that mirrored my own. She asked Captain Sullivan what she believed would happen next, now that the investigative committee had been formally established. Captain Sullivan admitted she did not know for certain, but that based on the reaction we had witnessed throughout the chamber that day, she suspected the Dominion's influence over allied species had suffered damage far beyond what a single formal investigation alone could measure. I thought, as we finally left the chamber that evening, of the months of quiet, careful preparation that had led to this single day, remembering the crushing helplessness I had felt, watching our humiliation spread across allied networks all those months earlier. I thought of Director Ashworth's early insistence on patience, of the long nights spent cross-referencing testimony from species who had suffered in silence for years, before finally finding the courage to speak, and of Ambassador Calloway's quiet confidence that truth, delivered with enough patience and precision, could withstand even the most carefully constructed lie. As I made my way back toward the steadfast accord that evening, walking alongside Emma through corridors filled with delegates still discussing the day's extraordinary session, I felt, for the first time since the night our first treaty had been so publicly burned, a genuine sense that the humiliation we had endured was finally beginning to transform into something far more significant than anyone, including the Dominion themselves, had ever anticipated. The days following the Assembly's decision to establish an investigative committee passed with an intensity none of us aboard the Steadfast Accord had fully anticipated. What had begun as a single formal presentation quickly grew into something far larger, as species across Allied space, encouraged by the willingness of others to finally speak openly, began coming forward with their own accounts of manipulation at the hands of the Dominion. I spent long hours alongside Emma and the rest of our documentation team, working with the newly formed investigative committee to help verify each new piece of testimony as it arrived, cross-referencing patterns we had already identified against fresh accounts from species we had never previously had contact with. Director Ashworth remained aboard the station throughout this period, coordinating closely with committee representatives to ensure Earth's original evidence remained fully accessible for independent verification. I noticed a subtle shift in how other delegations treated our team during this time, an increasing willingness to approach us directly with questions or additional information, rather than the cautious distance many had maintained during our initial arrival. One afternoon, roughly 2 weeks after our original presentation, I was called into a private meeting alongside Captain Sullivan and Director Ashworth, along with several senior members of the investigative committee. A representative from a species called the Corvain, who I learned had been appointed to lead the committee's technical verification efforts, informed us that their independent analysis had fully confirmed the authenticity of every piece of evidence Earth had originally presented, including the intercepted internal communication, outlining the deliberate manipulation of our treaty footage. He explained that this confirmation, combined with the growing volume of corroborating testimony from other species, had placed significant pressure on the Assembly to consider formal consequences against Dominion leadership, a possibility that had seemed almost unthinkable only weeks earlier, given the extent of their traditional influence throughout Allied space. I felt a quiet satisfaction hearing this news, though I noticed Captain Sullivan's expression remained carefully measured, a reminder of her earlier insistence that our mission had never depended on punishment or revenge, but on the simple, undeniable presentation of truth. She reminded the committee representative, during our discussion, that Earth's primary interest remained focused on ensuring this pattern of manipulation could not continue unchecked, rather than seeking any particular consequence against the Dominion specifically. Later that same week, Ambassador Vantak requested a private meeting with our delegation, a request that surprised everyone aboard the Steadfast Accord, given his visible discomfort during our original presentation weeks earlier. Ambassador Calloway agreed to the meeting, inviting Captain Sullivan and myself to accompany him, given our direct involvement in the documentation process that had led to this moment. The meeting took place within a small, neutral conference room near the center of the assembly station, arranged through official channels to ensure both delegations felt secure, discussing matters that had grown increasingly sensitive as the investigation continued. Ambassador Vantak arrived alone, his earlier composure replaced by something closer to genuine exhaustion, a stark contrast to the confident, almost musical voice I remembered from our original treaty signing so many months earlier. He began the meeting by acknowledging, more directly than he had during the formal assembly session, that the manipulation of our original treaty footage had indeed been coordinated at a senior level within Dominion leadership, though he insisted his own personal involvement had been limited to following instructions he had not fully agreed with at the time. Ambassador Calloway listened carefully throughout this admission, his expression giving little indication of how he intended to respond. When Vantak finally finished speaking, Calloway asked him a simple question that lingered in the quiet room for a long moment afterward. He asked whether the Dominion leadership responsible for this strategy had ever considered the possibility that a species they viewed as young and inexperienced might respond not with anger, but with the patience necessary to eventually expose the full pattern of manipulation they had relied upon for so many years against so many different species. Vantak did not offer an immediate answer, his silence carrying more weight than any response could have provided. Eventually, he admitted that Dominion leadership had grown accustomed to newer species reacting with panic or desperate denial following similar manipulation, a reaction that typically reinforced rather than challenged the false narrative being presented. He acknowledged that Earth's decision to respond instead with careful documentation and patient presentation had caught Dominion leadership entirely unprepared, a strategy they had never previously encountered from any species during his own extensive service within their diplomatic corps. I found myself watching this exchange with a strange mixture of satisfaction and quiet sympathy, understanding that Vantak himself likely represented only a small piece of a much larger system he had participated in without ever fully controlling its direction. Captain Sullivan, sensing perhaps a similar sentiment, asked him directly whether he believed meaningful change within Dominion leadership was possible following the exposure of this pattern, or whether the investigation currently underway would ultimately change little beyond the immediate consequences facing those directly implicated. Vantak considered the question carefully before responding, admitting that he did not know for certain, but that the sheer scale of testimony now coming forward from species across Allied space had already created pressure within Dominion leadership that he had never witnessed during his years of service. He suggested that regardless of the investigation's final outcome, the traditional assumption that manipulation could occur without meaningful consequence had likely been permanently disrupted by Earth's willingness to document and expose the pattern so thoroughly. The meeting concluded shortly afterward without any formal resolution, though I sensed a subtle shift in the tension that had defined our earlier interactions with Dominion representatives. As we left the conference room, Ambassador Calloway remarked quietly that regardless of whatever consequences the investigative committee ultimately recommended, conversations like the one we had just had represented a form of accountability the Dominion had likely never expected to face from any species they had previously manipulated so thoroughly. Over the following weeks, the investigative committee continued gathering testimony and verifying evidence from an ever-growing number of species willing to come forward. I spent much of this time working closely with Emma and our documentation team, helping organize the expanding archive of testimony into a format the committee could review efficiently, occasionally traveling briefly to other sections of the assembly station to assist with verification meetings involving species whose experiences closely mirrored our own. During one such meeting, I met a young representative from a species called the Ilvain, whose government had suffered a manipulation campaign remarkably similar to ours, though it had occurred so many years earlier that most of their current leadership had grown up believing the false narrative surrounding their own diplomatic failure was simply an accurate reflection of their people's shortcomings. Hearing him describe the quiet, generational shame his people had carried, a shame finally beginning to lift as evidence of the true cause emerged, reminded me once again of the significance behind the work we had undertaken so many months earlier. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the Assembly announced that a formal session would be held to review the committee's complete findings and determine appropriate consequences based on the overwhelming evidence gathered throughout the process. I felt a familiar nervous anticipation as this session approached, remembering the tension I had carried before our original presentation, though this time the feeling carried a different quality, less uncertainty and more genuine hope regarding what the outcome might finally represent for every species who had contributed testimony to this investigation. On the morning of the final session, I found myself once again standing beside Emma and Captain Sullivan near the entrance of the assembly chamber, watching delegates from dozens of species file inside, many exchanging quiet nods of acknowledgement with our own delegation as they passed. The atmosphere felt entirely different from our original arrival months earlier, the curiosity and quiet mockery replaced by something closer to genuine respect, earned not through demand or confrontation, but through months of patient, careful documentation that had ultimately proven impossible to dismiss. As we entered the chamber to take our seats for what promised to be a historic session, I thought once more of the crushing humiliation I had felt watching our first treaty burn so publicly before dawn all those months earlier. I understood now, more fully than I ever had during those difficult early days, exactly why Ambassador Calloway had insisted on patience over immediate reaction, and exactly how far that patience had ultimately carried us, from a single falsified broadcast designed to humiliate an entire species, toward a moment that now promised to reshape the very foundation of trust throughout the wider galactic community. The final session of the Assembly opened with a formality unlike anything I had witnessed during our earlier appearances. Every seat within the chamber filled, additional observers gathered along the outer walls to witness what many delegates had already begun referring to as one of the most significant proceedings the Assembly had conducted in generations. The presiding officer began by summarizing the extensive findings of the investigative committee, confirming publicly what our documentation team had already known for weeks, that the manipulation of Earth's original treaty footage represented only a single instance of a much broader pattern, one that had affected at least 11 different species across Allied space, over a period spanning more than 2 decades. He confirmed that the internal communications gathered throughout the investigation left no reasonable doubt regarding the coordinated, deliberate nature of this pattern, authorized at senior levels within Dominion leadership, rather than the result of isolated actions by individual officials. I watched the Dominion delegation throughout this summary, noting the absence of the confident, dismissive posture I remembered from our original arrival months earlier. Ambassador Vantak sat quietly among his fellow delegates, his expression carrying the same weary resignation I had witnessed during our private meeting weeks before. Following this summary, the presiding officer invited final statements from any delegation directly affected by the pattern of manipulation confirmed through the investigation. Representatives from species I had come to know personally throughout the preceding weeks rose one by one to share brief, measured statements, each expressing a similar sentiment, gratitude that their experiences had finally been acknowledged, combined with a cautious hope that formal accountability might prevent similar manipulation from affecting other species in the future. When it came time for Earth's own formal statement, Ambassador Calloway rose to address the chamber personally, his voice carrying the same calm steadiness I remembered from every difficult moment throughout our long journey toward this day. He thanked the Assembly for its willingness to investigate the evidence Earth had presented with the seriousness it deserved, acknowledging that this outcome had never been guaranteed given the Dominion's significant historical influence throughout Allied space. He reminded the chamber, in words that stayed with me long after that session concluded, that Earth had never sought this outcome through anger or demand for punishment alone. He explained that our true goal had always been simpler and, in some ways, far more ambitious, to demonstrate that patience, careful documentation, and an unwavering commitment to truth could overcome even the most deeply established systems of manipulation, regardless of how confident those systems had become in their own permanence. He closed his statement by expressing hope that the outcome of this investigation would encourage other species, both those who had already come forward and those who might still be hesitant to share their own experiences, to understand that silence in the face of manipulation only allows such patterns to continue unchecked, while patient, well-documented truth carries a strength capable of eventually overcoming even the most powerful voices willing to distort it. The chamber fell into a respectful silence following his statement, broken eventually by a formal vote regarding the consequences recommended by the investigative committee. I watched, alongside Emma and the rest of our crew, as delegate after delegate cast their vote in favor of significant, formal restrictions on Dominion influence within key diplomatic and economic processes throughout Allied space, along with a formal requirement for public acknowledgement of the manipulation pattern confirmed through the investigation. The vote passed with an overwhelming majority, a result that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those early, painful weeks following our original humiliation. As the final vote count appeared on the chamber's central display, I felt a wave of emotion I had not fully expected, a mixture of relief, quiet pride, and a lingering awareness of just how much patient, careful work had been required to reach this single historic moment. Following the session's conclusion, I found myself standing once again near the Steadfast Accord's docking bay, watching delegates from various species pass by, many offering quiet words of gratitude or respect as they made their way toward their own departing vessels. Audrin Callis approached me one final time before his own departure, thanking me personally for the role our documentation team had played in finally bringing his people's experience to light after so many years of quiet suffering. He told me that regardless of whatever challenges lay ahead as species across Allied space worked to rebuild trust, damaged by years of hidden manipulation, he felt genuine hope for the first time in longer than he could remember. Hope rooted not in blind optimism, but in the simple, undeniable fact that truth, given enough patience and enough careful documentation, could still overcome even the most deeply entrenched systems of deception. As the Steadfast Accord finally prepared for its return journey toward Earth, Captain Sullivan gathered the crew one final time within the ship's main hall. She reminded us that our mission had never truly been about defeating the Dominion or proving Earth's superiority among the wider galactic community. It had been about demonstrating a simple, powerful truth, that even a young species, freshly humiliated before an entire galaxy, could choose patience over panic, documentation over desperation, and ultimately transform a moment of profound public embarrassment into a foundation for lasting respect and trust. I spent much of our journey home reflecting on everything that had happened since that terrible night in the communications bay, when I had first watched our original treaty burned so publicly before dawn. I thought of the long months of quiet documentation that followed, the careful construction of a case built not on anger, but on patience and precision. I thought of the many species who had finally found the courage to share their own experiences once Earth demonstrated that truth, presented properly, could still overcome even the most powerful voices willing to distort it. As Earth finally came into view through the observation window during our final approach, its familiar blue curve glowing softly against the darkness of space, I felt a quiet sense of closure settle over me, one I had not expected to feel so completely, given everything we had endured throughout this long, difficult journey. Emma joined me near the window, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, both simply watching our home planet grow larger, as the Steadfast Accord continued its final descent toward the very station where our story had begun so many months earlier. She eventually broke the silence, asking whether I believed Earth's reputation among the wider galactic community had truly been restored following everything that had happened. I considered her question carefully before answering, remembering Ambassador Calloway's words from our very first difficult night together, when he had told me that reputation defended too quickly and too emotionally often collapses precisely because it looks like guilt, while reputation built on patient, undeniable truth eventually earns something far more valuable than mere restoration. I told her that I believed Earth had not simply restored its reputation, but had built something entirely new in its place, a reputation grounded not in the empty promises exchanged during that original signing ceremony so long ago, but in a demonstrated willingness to pursue truth patiently, even when every immediate instinct urged us toward anger and desperate defense instead. As the steadfast Accord finally docked at the same orbital station where our journey had begun, I stepped once more into the observation bay where I had first watched our original treaty collapse into humiliation so many months earlier. The station felt different now, the same physical space carrying an entirely different atmosphere, one shaped by everything we had endured and ultimately overcome together throughout this long, unexpected journey. I understood, standing there in that familiar room, that the humiliation which had once seemed like the end of Earth's hopeful entry into the wider galactic community had instead become the beginning of something far more lasting, a reputation built not on the fragile promises of a single signing ceremony, but on the patient, unwavering pursuit of truth that had ultimately reshaped how an entire galaxy understood the quiet, determined strength of a species they had once so carelessly dismissed as beneath their notice. As I finally turned to leave the observation bay that evening, ready to return home for the first time in what felt like an entirely different lifetime, I carried with me a simple understanding that would stay with me for the rest of my career among the stars. A single dawn had once been enough to burn every agreement and every ounce of hope we had carried into that first treaty signing, but it had taken many more dawns, built one patient day at a time, to prove that Earth's true strength had never depended on the fragile promises exchanged that first difficult morning, but on the quiet, unwavering patience we carried through every difficult moment that followed, until the truth itself finally became impossible for anyone, anywhere across the galaxy, to ignore.